Hey there, everyone. Rick here with Beginner's Mind. We've got a great episode in store for you. This one's unique because I didn't actually talk to a beginner this time. I talked to an expert. And that expert is famed band composer, conductor, and performer Brian Balmages. Brian and I had a great talk about Beginner's Mind and how it relates to expertise. I think there's some great stories here, some really neat insights, and I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. All right, Brian, it's so great to have you here on the show and get a chance to talk with you. I know you're a super busy guy, so I really appreciate you taking time out from your schedule. I thought we could talk a little bit about Beginner's Mind, and I've got my copy of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and there's a quote in here that I was thinking we could discuss, and it goes like this. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the experts, there are few. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, seeing as though you're an expert, but I find that your work always has a fresh perspective to it. There's always something new and refreshing, even though it's uniquely yours.
Sure. Well, I have to tell you, in my mind, it's interesting when you put that quote out there because one of the first things that I think of is, well, I need to change that quote. And my first thought is, in the beginner's mind, the possibilities are many, and in the expert's mind, the possibilities are many more. And that's something that I always think about. But I think with any musician, the hope is the more you learn, the more you discover that you still have left to learn.
Mm.
Um, in my case, the more I write, the more I become a quote unquote expert at composition or conducting or whatever it is that you want to call that. I find the more I suddenly realize, like, the more possibilities there are, the more colors there are, the more composers there are, the more genres there are. And so I tend to go somewhat in the opposite way. And I can understand the idea of becoming an expert that becomes more of a focused way of doing things or more of a particular way of achieving something. But as a creator, as an artist, one of the things that I think about is the more I get into this world, the more I realize the possibilities are even that much more endless.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you ever feel overwhelmed by the possibilities, like having too much choice about where to
Um,
go with things?
I certainly get overwhelmed. um, uh, is it about the possibilities? I don't know if it's about the possibilities because I think as you become more and more focused on your trade, you become more aware of all the different possibilities, but at the same time, you also have a greater grasp on how to utilize those possibilities, how to access all these new avenues of information that you may have discovered. And in my case, I think the majority of what I do, especially to stay fresh, is, I think early on, and this is really interesting because it does apply to that quote. I think early on, one of the things that you really see, especially in younger composers, is there's all these different avenues, all these
Mm.
possibilities, and we try to seize all of them as young composers or young artists and try to kind of put everything we've learned, everything we've experienced into one piece. And very often it doesn't work. It seems very disjointed. And so I don't know if it's a sense of overwhelmingness. Matter of fact, one of the reasons I'm able to stay fresh is because when these different things come into play, whether it's a different genre, a different style, what I try to do is harness one of those new directions and take that one direction and try to put it into a piece and then save the different ones for another piece down the road, and try to really focus and develop one idea, and then see where that wants to go, and sometimes it involves bringing in a second one, but very often that's my approach.
Okay. So when you're doing that and you're finding that you have a lot of ideas that you want to explore later, is that a conscious decision then? Do you catalog those and keep those for later and refer back when you're starting a new piece? What's your process with that?
It very often that is what I do. Very often an idea will come to me and I'll say, "Oh, it's a great idea, but not for this piece." And so I'll make a little catalog of it. I've got a score paper that if I'm near that, I'll write it down. One of my great composing devices lately is this guy. And one of the reasons why is because I can be in the car, and if I hear something, I'll just quick pop on the voice memo and just sing something into the phone. And I've had several. I just finished a euphonium concerto, and the very beginning idea is just me going blah, 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 and singing on the phone. But it's enough for me to remember what I was thinking about. So yeah, absolutely, I catalog them. And there's having that catalog of things really sometimes helps me from becoming overwhelmed overall. This whole process of just writing, having to constantly create, because I kind of feel like, okay, I can draw on that idea. I can reference that motive and use that for a piece. So.
Yeah, interesting. So how much has your process changed since when you were first starting out? Have things evolved drastically, or do you feel like you work in a lot of the same ways you did when you were starting?
No. I think my variety of approaches has expanded. I think when I first started off, you got to remember, I grew up as a trumpet player, and I played professionally, and that's what I did. And so I was a creature of habit in that every morning I would warm up, and I would warm up for an hour, and I would go through my daily routines after that. And I had a system in place, and I tried to apply that to composition. Well, I'm going to start every piece the same way. I'm going to sketch by hand, or I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And then my process started to evolve in terms of just realizing, you know what? Every piece is different, and sometimes the approach has to be different as well. And interestingly enough, then I started thinking back about the trumpet, and I said, well, you know what? Even though I had that same routine, there were days that I felt incredible, and I could warm up much quicker. There were days where my chops felt stiff and rough, and it took me an hour and a half to 2 hours of just certain things to really get it going. And that's when I realized, you know what? I was varying my warm up much more than I thought. And so I do vary my compositional approach. There are pieces that I will write with pencil and paper, away from a piano, away from everything, just because I can't write them any other way. I just can't. Just can't make it happen. There are other pieces that I will write directly into a software notation program, and there's yet other pieces that I actually sit down and write almost the entire piece at the piano. And each piece is kind of specific to the ideas. There are certain pieces that I've tried to write directly into notation programs, and it just won't work because there's too much focus on the orchestration, and the form is getting lost, or I don't have a chance to deal with all the inner lines, so it really depends. But those three have held, but the amount that I utilize all three has definitely expanded quite a bit. And sometimes I use a combination of both now. Sometimes I'll write the beginning one way, and then I'll get to the end and write that a different way. And sometimes the order I'll write a piece will change. Sometimes I'll write the end first and then go back and figure out how I'm going there. So a lot of those things have evolved as I have evolved.
Yeah, it sounds to me like you're very conscious of trying different approaches to keep things fresh. One of the things I've been talking to a lot of different people about new skills that they've been learning as adults and as accomplished learners, and just about everybody's talked about feeling some sort of frustration as they hit a point where they're not sure if they're making progress or progress is slow. And what you were talking about reminded me a little bit of that. Do you ever find when you're composing in a certain mode and using a certain approach, how do you know when to change approaches and when to push through and keep going with the direction you're going, hoping that a breakthrough is coming down the line?
Boy, that's the $1,000,000 question. I think for me, when you do this enough, there comes a point where you're very intimate with the inspiration around you, and that refers to the presence of it and the lack of it. And sometimes it's not a question of trying to power through, but changing the approach, even changing your vision of it. There have been pieces, for example, that I've just been stuck on, running into a brick wall. and the wall won't move. Sometimes it's taken me to a point where I had to realize that I didn't even know what I was writing about.
Mm.
And I thought the piece was about this, but suddenly I realized it's really not about that at all. It's about this. And then when I suddenly changed that, suddenly a whole world opened up to me. And so sometimes that comes into play. Sometimes I will change my writing approach and I'll say, you know what? I've been writing at the computer and it's killing me. I need a change of venue, so to speak, and I'll go to a piano and I'll write there. Sometimes that's not working and I'll just go and sit at a table, go completely somewhere different, change my environment. Uh, and sometimes that has a great reward. Sometimes it has the exact opposite effect. Your mind and your body get used to being creative in a certain place, um, and so very often I like to try and create in that space. But at the same time, uh, it's there are reasons we come up with random ideas in the shower, or when we're walking the dog or whatever it might be. And so sometimes I'll use those location changes to try and inspire me and get me away from that getting stuck on one idea. So there are a lot of different ways that I try to navigate it. On a rare occasion, I will stop writing a piece entirely and I will move to a different commission altogether.
Mm.
If I have an idea for that commission. And very often I get so motivated by a different piece that I go and I'm able to complete the other piece entirely before coming back and addressing the one that I'm stuck on. And that gives me enough separation to really feel comfortable getting back into a piece. Plus, it takes off the back end pressure of not having to worry about that next commission because I was able to finish that one. And now I can really relax and
Mm.
focus my energy on this piece that I now have had space from, and I've lessened the amount of pressure, so and so on the back end, so to speak.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Because again, it sounds like going back to our original quote, it sounds like you're still finding ways to stay open and not get frustrated, or at least allow your frustration maybe to take you in a different direction and help solve some issues from other commissions that you're working on. So it's really interesting. I'm curious if you have any suggestions for maybe somebody who is a beginning composer and wants to start writing but isn't quite sure what to do or how to start and is feeling frustrated without any ideas coming.
Sure. Um, one of the things that I always tell composers that are just getting started, especially ones that are in school, right? And so in college, in high school, middle, whatever it may be, um, the first thing I tell them is to write for what you know,
Mm.
or who you know. Right? And both of those are important. So write for what you know. If you're a percussionist, write a percussion trio. If you're a bassoon player, write for two bassoons, or write for a bassoon and oboe and write a duet. If you play piano and you happen to be and your best friend is a euphonium player, write a piece for euphonium and piano. Write for instruments that you know, but also for people that you know, because if you write for people that you know, it'll get played. It may not get performed, but it'll get played. And hearing your music played is one of the greatest teachers ever, because there are certain things that you will find don't work at all. But it worked on the computer, but it worked in my head,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't work, orally. I remember one of my first times that I was writing for, again, people and things that I knew. I wrote for a trumpet ensemble. I was a trumpet player. I was in a trumpet ensemble. They were my friends. I wrote for them. And I remember writing this piece that sounded incredible when I was playing it on the piano. I brought it into the trumpet ensemble and we read it down and it sounded nothing like what I wrote. And I couldn't figure out why until it occurred to me. And this is going to sound really ridiculous, but it's true. I suddenly realized that a trumpet ensemble doesn't have a sustain pedal.
Okay.
And I had written this and I was always holding the sustain pedal when I would write this thing at the piano. And it sounded great. And suddenly that was this big eye-opening moment for me. And I wouldn't have learned that had I not just written for it. And so what did I do? The next piece that I wrote, I kind of built moments of sustain into my piece. And I factored that in. And what I started to do was develop, I always say there's two bags, right? This is the bag of tricks that I like. This is the bag of tricks that I never want to have. Both bags are constantly filling up. The difference is my good bag of tricks, as I do more and more, this bag gets heavier, so does my bad one, but I always leave that one at home. And I
Ah,
don't use that one. And I always carry this one with me. And the heavier the good bag gets, not only am I more comfortable drawing from that, but then combinations of things that I didn't used to be comfortable with. I say, well, I know I've done this and that's in that bag, and I know if I've done this and that's in that bag, I bet you I could combine the two of those and still have a good sound. And so I'm starting to trust my ear more, trust myself more because I've developed a large palette of things. So absolutely, write for people you know, write for things you know, and continue to expand. Take advantage for those young composers. Absolutely. The other thing I always tell composers is to buy scores of music that you know or that you've heard that you really like. Um, could be a Mahler symphony. It could be a string quartet. The Dover scores are great because they're cheap. They're really cheap,
mhm.
but they're great score. They're a great resource. And then go out and buy a recording. And I always used to listen to these recordings watching the score and just circle places in the score that I thought sounded really cool without stopping the recording. I would listen the whole way through so that I could get a sense of linear, get a sense of
Sure.
flow and form.
Right.
And then I would go back and look at the scores and say, why do I like this? Is it the harmony? Is it the way he combined different instruments? Is it the texture? Is it color articulation? Is it the use of percussion? What made me love that section so much is in effect and start to learn that way.
Wow. Yeah, that's great advice. And it sounds so much like how you would have a student learn an instrument. With a
Absolutely.
great model and um, giving them goals that they can achieve. Like you were saying, to write for what you know and people you know, and play music that you can play well
Right.
instead of I'm going to write a symphony my first time out. I've never
Right.
written anything. That's what I'm going to do.
Absolutely. And it
Yeah.
was a big deal for me. And you got to understand, I say that because that's how I did it. I don't have a comp degree. I never studied composition formally. I just wrote. And believe me, I failed many times. Um, but I learned as much, if not more, from those failures than I did from my successes, right? I'm thrilled with my successes, but was it a huge learning experience? It was a great achievement,
Hmm.
but I didn't learn as much as
Mm.
I did from the failures. So even those failures are successes in that standpoint.
So, do you feel with the successes and achievements that you have under your belt now, does that afford you a little bit of luxury with what you can take on next, or do you feel like there's some pressure on you to compose in a certain way or compose certain pieces?
You know, I think there's a very interesting balance that you talk about, and your question is specifically, honestly, referencing this idea of becoming very well known in a certain grade level or a certain genre, and whether to try to capitalize on that. Um, my view on that has always been very, very specific. Uh, there are composers out there that have written a piece of music which was very successful and have taken the standpoint of saying that was huge. I'm going to write I'm going to follow it up
Hmm.
with another piece that's like that. Um, that's their prerogative, and I have no issues. Well, I do have issues with that, but it's their choice, and I'm never going to hold them. I'm never going to come at them for that. Uh, very often, those are the composers, though, that wind up having two or three big hits, and then they start to fade out of the limelight.
Hmm.
One of the things that I'm always trying to do is very subtly trying to reinvent myself every time with every piece. One of the greatest compliments that I ever heard from somebody was, every piece that you write sounds different, but they all sound like you.
Oh, absolutely. I would agree with that 100%.
And I really appreciated that because I said, okay, well, every piece is evolving, right? Listen to a piece that I wrote 5, 10 years ago, compare it to a piece that I wrote last year. They're very different. They still sound like me, but they're evolving. My standpoint has always been, look, take Moscow 1941, right? One of my middle school band pieces. And I feel like the whole world has played that piece, and everybody plays it over and over again. Uh, and everybody's always says, oh, we're going to do another. And I've already written that piece. That
Mhm.
one's out there. Let people play that one. I'm going to evolve and see where I can go next, and how can I do something different, something new. People don't want Moscow 1942. They say they do. They say they do. But I guarantee you, if I write it, they're going to say, "Oh, but it just sounds like Moscow 1940." So I don't want to go that route.
Right.
And so you're always trying to reinvent yourself, but at the same time, not to a point where you don't sound like yourself anymore. I am who I am. And when I first started writing, I thought I wanted to be like Michael Kolgrass and David Maslanka, and I wanted to write this really intense music. And not to say that what I write is not very intense, but I think personality-wise, I wanted to be who they were. Right?
Mhm.
I had played their music. I had played things like Winds from the Wall. I had played things like the Maslanka Symphony and the Child's Garden of Dreams, and a lot of really intense music. And so I started off trying to write like that. And very quickly I realized the major problem with that is that I'm not them. That's not who I am. And I'm not being true to myself. And so I had to learn to become true to myself and write to represent who I am, so my music has more purity to it. It's not as forced. And then, at the same time, how can I evolve and continue to expand who I am within my voice?
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's always whenever we get a chance to talk, it's always refreshing to hear your take on art and what it means to be an artist, and it just comes across in everything. Any arrangement that I ever played with any of my bands of yours, or just any time I hear your music, I think that all rings true. So, um, those are pretty much all the questions I had prepared for our talk today. Is
Mm-hmm.
there anything that we missed that you want to talk about? Are you learning anything new outside of composing?
Oh, I feel like I'm, always trying to learn something new. I mean, one of the big things that I do, as you know, I do a lot of guest conducting.
Hmm.
Um, and that is one of my major vehicles right now for learning. It's become a major vehicle for me. And I talked about this on social media a couple days ago. But um, I have discovered that I actually probably love conducting more than I enjoy composing. And I think one of the reasons why is because I learn so much
Hmm.
from conducting and from score study. And I'm not talking, clearly, I'm not talking about my own pieces. I enjoy conducting my own pieces, but I enjoy conducting other composers much more. And I think it's because you get a chance to dive into somebody else's mind, and it's extraordinary
Hmm. Yeah.
to see what's there. And I always learn a lot, and it makes me a better musician. It makes me a better composer, and it makes me a better conductor. One without the other just doesn't work for me anymore. I need to be able to do both. One inspires the other, and it's funny because I'll look at music by these other composers, and I'll look at these scores and just say, how in the world? And I know I write music, and I like to think I do a fairly good job, but at the same time, I look at the music of some of these other composers, and I think to myself, like, how did they think of this? Like, how did they get this on paper?
Right.
And it's a lot of different pieces. I just did a piece by Julie Giroux, and it was just Vigil's Keep, and I'm looking at this going, how does she hear that? How did she get all these sounds down, and how does she write like that? Steve Bryant, with his saxophone concerto that came out recently. I love it. It's just great writing. Um, uh, how does he come, and we talk about this. I talk with these guys at Midwest, and we talk about their process, and all these different things. His concerto for wind ensemble. John Mackey's doing these great things. I mean, there's so many people out there that are writing so many great things. And so, yeah, whenever I conduct, boy, you better believe every concert that I do, I try to put one new piece on.
Hmm.
And people say just one, but you got to remember, I'm doing a lot of concerts every year. And so I don't want to put on too many, because if I do too many new pieces in one concert, then I'm not being fair to the performing ensemble because I'm not prepared. And so
Hmm.
by doing
Right.
one new piece, sometimes two, that allows me to truly dive into a new work. learn something, but at the same time, musically, make sure that I could bring something to every piece that I bring to an ensemble. So probably one of the greatest ways that I'm learning is through score study and conducting.
That's fantastic. And it sounds like cross training.
Yeah, really. I mean, yeah, it's a whole experience. I mean, it's a mind, body, physical, everything approach. It's a holistic approach.
Well, that's great. Well, again, Brian, thank you so much. I really, truly appreciate you taking the time to talk with me.
Absolutely.
And I really enjoyed it. And hopefully get to see you at Midwest.
I will be there.
All right.
I will be there in all of my glory. It's just an advertising call. I don't want to talk to them anyway.
All right. Well, thanks again, Brian. We'll talk to you soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rick.